reminded of, I think it's Jeremy Till who was talking about the day when we no longer discuss green architecture. It's a done thing. You know, everybody is sustainable. It has to be. What we talk about is red architecture, the stuff that actually so poorly performs. In fact, we shouldn't even be talking about it almost. I think so. That should be a given. I agree with you there. That should ultimately be a given. There are other things to discuss in our AI awards. Sustainability should be done. It should be just the done thing across the board. The other interesting thing I thought from Dermot was the work, which I do know of DIT fifth year, where to some degree, I suppose the point I'm trying to make there is that we don't know what the aesthetic is to be. And I think what's interesting is that the students have been given a fairly open canvas about what things should look like. And last time I was there, we were discussing, are they actually sort of almost engineers? I think they're grasping for a new aesthetic, for new uses, new functions. What should things look like? And I think that's a big question. We don't know. I think that question about, we will rest back with tradition to some degree, and we'll always be taking out of tradition. And there's also the eye to utopia. That utopia we don't know. Thanks.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I'll only say I'll accept Joe's proposition that the competition winners would meet the regulations if they met the budgets set by the QSs when constructed. Okay, that famous cost plan that you get your QS to do at the last minute, and he signs his life away in terms of the cost of the building. But I mean, two things I'd say. I mean, in principle, absolutely yes. I'm kind of interested that every time that all the buildings maybe that Joe showed, this idea that beautiful things break the rules. So I don't really understand where that comes from. Is that a modernist sort of ideal? That's, you know, it's the things that break the mode are the beautiful things. I would think that I would hope and determine that all our projects meet regulations. You could probably look at that house and say it doesn't meet the 25%. I think it's, in terms of glazing. So that's sort of sense of that view on things. And also this Mike's thing about not knowing, and I think that's what's exciting about architecture, and that's why we have to set challenges. We have to define a new future and test different things out. But I mean, again, back to Joe's lecture, I rely heavily on technology to do that. And engineers and architects and the whole collaborative creative fields that we have. I mean, I keep thinking back to myself when I did that project in school in second year on alternative energies, you know, where I drew out sort of wave machines and wind machines. And where are they? And that was like over, I don't know, 30 years ago. So what's going on? What is this the conspiracy that we still rely on oil, we still rely on all of these finite resources in the world, and what the hell are we doing about it? And that's where I think in terms of the students setting things up for themselves, is that they're the young people, they're the dynamic future, and how do they determine their future? And it's slightly different slant on things than we have. So that would be my two answers to that.
Can I ask Michael Koch to maybe make a comment? Michael is the founding board member of Green Building Council of Denmark and has had a presentation earlier on today. And I know he's an architect also, and he is particularly interested in architects leading the way in this area.
Well, for those of you that were next door, you could actually see a scheme on how much an architect can affect the performance of the building by actually knowing the impact of all what he's doing. And so transforming the basic form of the building, where you take in your light, thermal masses, where you put your different functions and so on. And that diagram showed that you could actually halve the energy consumption needed for a building just by architectural means. And I think we still are working too old-fashioned in the way, and I'm surprised to see, sorry if I sound offensive, but we saw several projects of houses lying in a rural landscape, quoting it's sustainable just because it's beauty. I mean, it's out of the grid, efficient, collective different systems that can provide optimal way of producing power and so on. At the same time, we live in a world where the number of population is increasing, so we cannot all live in rural areas isolated, depending on 1 or 2 cars to get to work and so on. That's not a sustainable way, and I think we tend to forget not only what I mentioned on the basics of the impact of what we do in architecture, but also the context we work in. We have to remember the basic planning on how the town works, and also look at the neighborhood structures and so on, how you affect your neighbor by winds, by shading, and so on, which kind of grid supplies that city. That has to be in order before you come in and decide how can you optimize your building. One of my colleagues says this transition is the biggest change in architecture since modernism, if we know how to use it. And this is architect work. We can't, let not the engineers do it. And then a little add-on, I could say I'm a little surprised to see that many of the buildings are so static, especially for those of you referring to nature. I mean, when the cat sleeps, it rolls itself together, reduces its surface, and flowers shut down and so on. I mean, if we look at a car industry, you can make a door that can open electrically 100 times a day. It can run in rain in 200 kilometers an hour and so on, which means that you could actually make facades that change according to, are you home, are you not home, is it raining, is it not raining, and so on. But we make very steady constructions. So we should have enough knowledge in our luggage to actually make a new transition in architecture. And I hope that's going to happen, and I don't wait for the engineers. Grab it.
I just want to make 2 comments in case we run out of time. And I have to have my way. There's just 2 things that I think I've picked up from the general conversation. I think everybody's pretty much on the same page that we are in a global climate change situation. That architects are, leaders and thought leaders in this area. And I suppose there's 2 things. If we are the thought leaders or the visionaries that we claim to be, where are the opportunities in this constraint of global climate change and increasing global population? That's the first thing. And then the other area I would see is in terms of regulations. We have a lot of regulations for good reason. But do the regulations stifle the innovation? I think that's a question we have to always ask ourselves, and that has always got to be it has always got to be at the front of our mind, that complying with regulations is not necessarily solving all of the problems. So this is our role, I think, this is why we need visionaries leading this area. And I suppose related to that then is we are in a market-driven environment, and how do we change society and practice our art of responsibility, which I think you said, Ger, which I quite like. I may use that again if you don't mind. Does anybody have any comment on those, Joe?
This is partly comment on that, and maybe partly just something to do with the dialogue that we're having up here. I think one of the answers, one of the issues we have is that, yes, an awful lot of buildings that are supposedly sustainable aren't. An awful lot of buildings that are supposedly sustainable are very ugly. And an awful lot of architects who design beautiful buildings, as a result, turn around and say, well, sustainable buildings are ugly. I'm building beautiful buildings. And I don't think that's good enough. I think one of the reasons we don't have the beautiful new aesthetics that will encapsulate this incredible level of sustainability that we desperately need as a society is because partly the most aesthetically talented of the architects that we have not come on board. I will never design a building as beautiful as the other 3 men at this table. Sadly, I know I won't. I'm better at other things. But if the most talented architects in the society actually embraced this and actually looked and challenged themselves and challenged the issues and really tried to express in the way they are able to do in so many extraordinary buildings that I would say maybe leak energy more than they should, but are extraordinary, we would have a new aesthetic and it would be appealing, it would look right. The other thing that I'd say is that architects often, we were hearing there earlier on how architecture is a mix of science and art and also of culture. I think we're very soft on science. And I really, just those two little examples of the thermal bridges I showed in my own example, just the actual discipline and the knowledge and the ability to say that detail leaks 17 times more heat than that every moment of the day, that should inform your design decisions. And if we actually calculated the damn thing, if we had that knowledge in-house, whether it's an architect technologist or it's ourselves, we would change our design. And I think that's extremely important. I think we need to get more serious about science as architects.
I have two comments from the floor. First, so, if you wouldn't mind, throwing your voice there. Or actually, yeah.
I think there's a problem with relying too heavily on science, especially when now a lot of science tends to reduce things far to the point of abstraction, and sustainability really demands holistic thinking. So focusing in on the details might lead us further astray,
Comment? Yes.
As one of the few engineers in the room, I actually don't want to be involved in the aesthetics of these magnificent buildings that we've seen. I want to support it, and all I'd ask is that the architects just get with it, stop bickering amongst yourselves, and actually start using this as a massive opportunity to make my life a better place to live. I'll support you, but just get with it, don't fight it.
Thanks, Michelle. Kieran Cuff. I lecture in spatial planning in DIT. I'm also an architect. I remember a fantastic story about Kevin Roche when he had designed the Oakland Museum, which was essentially, or the Oakland Museum, which had a park on top, and it was a fantastic piece of architecture with this beautiful green landscape and a fantastic museum underneath. The only problem was it leaked like a sieve. So Kevin Roche being Kevin Roche, he supplied buckets with courtesy Kevin Roche architects on them to catch the leaks. The point of the story is he broke the rules, took pride in breaking the rules, and I think there's nothing wrong with doing that. But I think rules can be a fantastic producer of good architecture. I always remember in college that, or even in real life, the more constraints there are on the project, very often the better result. And I think the constraints of the new Part L are the constraints that we meet in 2018, 2020 of near zero carbon will produce even better architecture. Sure, at the moment, to many people, Part L means your windows can't be greater than 30% of the floor area. But that's a rule of thumb. There are occasions when large windows work. There's a school, I can't remember the name of the architect in the UK, that designed in the 1960s that has almost complete glazing, but it also has a lot of concrete. It absorbs the heat and releases it slowly. It works quite well. I think rules can work. I think they can work well. I think they will produce even better architecture, and I think there are fantastic examples, both in Ireland, but in countries like Austria, Denmark, Sweden, that show that you can reach very low energy use and also produce brilliance. And I don't think this needs to be polarized. I certainly think we can all work in this together. Thank you.
Kieran, can I just say that I would back you up on that 100%, because I mean, my instinct is that we're in a room where we've just been sort of knocked over a little bit, knocked over by this Part L, which is very technical, very difficult to get one's head around. And I suppose what I think is that, I mean, I was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was at the Economist building with my students, and we were looking at the condition of weathering of that building, a building but finished in 1964. And we looked at the drawings in the V&A, and the first thing that struck us about that building was that there was absolutely no insulation in the walls. None. In the floor, in the walls, in the roof, nowhere. Literally, you put your hand on a wall and you were outside. Now, I think that if anything, that illustrates a point, which is about the fact that I think we move on culturally, and I think we absorb these things, and we invent new ways of becoming opportunistic about the constraints that they put upon us. And I don't think necessarily that they are constraints. I think as architects, we operate strategically. I don't think we just operate about detail. I think we start with the strategy. And there are drawings that we do about orientation. There's questions about location, about position. There's general things that we do at the start which set up a pattern about making good buildings. And I think that the point that was made about how we connect with towns, how we connect with cities, the whole question of transport, the bigger picture is very, very important, and we have to think about that. When it comes down to the question of the detail, I find in our office that we're just really also on a learning curve about this, trying to find, shall we say, the metaphor, trying to find the new way of making this work for us as architects. And I don't mean that it's a problem. In fact, it's just one of the other things that we take on board, like all the other things we have to take on board as part of making a building, part of developing a strategy. And I suppose what inevitably means is you don't end up going down certain routes, going down certain paths, because it's going to not work. It's just not going to work. So you just avoid the situations that are going to be problematic, as you do in most other situations when you're looking at other building regulations and the like. But one last point I will make. I think society is bigger than just architects. Society is about all of us as individuals understanding the principles of things. And the way our economy works, it doesn't just work with architects making buildings. Many other people in this economy make buildings, right down to individuals. And I'm thinking of my mother or my father making a building. What concept or understanding are they going to have? How are they going to be able to get their heads around some of the graphs and diagrams that were shown here in terms of basic principles about things? I think we really need to talk in very simple language. Use very simple language that people can understand. So if somebody goes out to do something, that they're doing something properly, they're not going to have to consult a million rules and then suddenly be told by an inspector that it's all wrong. Start again, you've wasted all your money. I think we have a big issue here to cover in terms of how we explain these things to ourselves. I think that's very important.
Hey, can I just ask, I'm an engineer, my background is not an architect. Do you think there's been a general feeling that quite often sustainability and sustainable building sort of holds back us architects making beautiful buildings? Do you think the reason behind that is either number one, finance and the cost, or is it that we don't have the technology and the skill base to be able to make these beautiful buildings sustainable? Does that make sense? Feel free to say no.
Merit.
I think the question of finance and cost technology is secondary to the question of politics, because really what is required is a political vision to serve as a kind of motivation. Because part of the difficulty is that when we have discussions like this where things get fragmented into shards of discussions about technology or shards of discussions about details or whatever, it doesn't, somehow coalesce into this, let's say, slightly broader notion that there's a fundamental gap, well, massive gap really, between the planet on which we live and the way, not the way in which we live on it in terms of, let's say, unsustainable practice and driving all over the countryside or whatever, but in fact how we look at it, how we observe it. And that, I think, that's a political question of the highest order, and it's therefore an aesthetic question of the highest order. Architects have very little ability to shape aesthetics. We have politicians, I think, well, not politicians, but the political discourse has a power to shape aesthetics much more strongly, and in fact to drive some of the issues that you're referring to, because certainly finance is the political issue, as is the future. The future must be the fundamental political issue. So if we talk about aesthetics outside of politics, we talk about technology, and we talk about, we get bogged down, I think. And so at a certain moment, this is part of why I wanted to show that little snippet of Kennedy. There was a moment in which something was galvanized, and whether it was good or bad doesn't really, it's kind of, one can discuss all of these other motivations, but at the end of the day, it resulted in something that fundamentally has changed, so much irrevocably. And I think we have to take some time to consider it from that distance, if you like.
Just very briefly, I'd like to offer or express a note of consolation. Architects aren't the only ones struggling. I've spent my days as a structural engineer engaging as broadly as I could with engineering and architecture, but I never really took on board the requirements of energy efficiency or these aspects. And I also, and I think many engineers, find it quite difficult to make the bridge. It is a period of major shift, and I'm reminded of Yeats's very prosaic injunction to versifiers, Irish poets, learn your trade. I think we all have to re-establish our basis, or reconnect with the base of our education and broaden it in ways that I personally haven't bothered to in the past. So it's not just a problem for architects, I think.
Can you shout?
I can indeed.
Okay, great.
Jim Rhodes from the School of Architecture at DIT, Bolton Street. One of the big messages I've got from the conference today is that what we need to do is consider the energy that goes into the materials we use in our buildings, and the energy then that we need to expend during the lifetime of our buildings. And if we just took those two kind of guiding principles alone, they would be a good start, I think. Another statistic that came up this morning is that 47% of the contribution towards CO2, the maintenance CO2, comes from the production of cement. I think it was that. People can correct me if I'm wrong. That's incredible. So one idea might be for architects that we try to do some buildings that don't use cement at all, just for once. Just to respond, lastly, point is to respond to Dermot's kind of frustration with why we're still using oil, for example. Why is this an issue? It's because in the world there are big interest groups who control all that. Many of the politicians in America and in Europe are also heads of the oil companies. They're also the ones who are linked to the industrial military complex, who cause wars related to the production of oil. So that's the reason. There are geopolitical stuff going on there that we need to challenge as well. And I know that might all seem too broad for people, but that's the reality and we need to be aware of it.
Just to comment on the last one on cement, actually it again shows that we have to deeper into the facts we are dealing with. Because if you start working with LCAs, you will find out that steel has a 10 times bigger environmental impact than concrete has. And then if you go to aluminium, it has further 10 times as big an impact, which means 100 times compared to concrete. So if you do an LCA in an office building, you would see that aluminium is in the top 3 together with steel and concrete, even the fact that concrete has the highest amount. So we still have a learning curve to understand all these issues. So it's not a transition from just concrete to something else. Everything interacts with each other. And there are many tools coming up in the market that help you address the balance between lighting and energy, and soon we also make tools for LCA calculation and so on. So we have a new toolbox that we have to understand, and that will affect architecture. So perhaps instead of not using concrete, we should use it in a smarter way, making shells, using carbon fibers for structuring instead of steel. The only reason concrete is so thick is to protect the steel from rusting. It's not to structural issues and so on. So there's a lot of solutions just lying ahead of us. We just have to understand all the balls we have in there at the same time.
Thank you. We're coming to a close now, so I'm going to take 2 more questions or 2 more comments from the audience, and then we'll have a little roundup, if that's okay. Do you need this be useful?
Sorry, I just wanted to make a comment on the political thing again that you mentioned, just to make you all aware that there's a proposal to put an oil rig 6 kilometres off the coast in Dohe, and I don't think that any architect or anybody in this room should support it. I think it's extremely interesting that Phil Hogan was here this morning, but he didn't stay to listen to anything of what we were talking about today, which is extremely important.
Hiya. I don't think any conversation is balanced without maybe a comment from a contractor. I suppose with the changes that are coming through, there's a sea change with quality and its attention to detail. And I suppose my question is, how do you recommend architects should deal with the tender process? Because currently, you know, there's the construction companies that will embrace them, they'll provide the training, they'll upskill, and this at a cost. But currently, tenders come down to price, and there's a lot of contractors there that don't care. How do you differentiate? How would you incorporate it into your tender process? Because I feel without you know, attention to detail through the construction, you're not going to achieve the targets that you require.
Thanks for that. Can I comment on that? I suppose this discussion is kind of a little bit more global than that. I mean, we have so many regulations and rules, and procurement is a large stumbling block for getting quality. But I think procurement, the essence of the failure in procurement is the failure to ask the right questions. And I think for what's happening here, what the discussion here is, we have to ask the right questions to get the answers and go in the direction that we need to go in order to achieve a sustainable and beautiful life and world.
I do think it's a very interesting question, because I mean, I think the relationship between the builder and the architect probably changed around the period of modernism, when suddenly we were making bolt together architecture, and suddenly we had to make all of these drawings for you guys to put together a building, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to put it together. Whereas prior to that, it was a situation where architects relied on the builder a lot for kind of basic knowledge about how to put things together. So if we think about Fusion, or if we think about any architects like that, for instance, they would have a deeper relationship with the contractor in terms of how to make something. So it'd be kind of much more symbiotic kind of relationship. And maybe as a result of this process, I'm only speculating, the relationship between contractors and designers will have to become a bit more symbiotic, because I think that the contractors themselves will also have to build their own knowledge and respond to this situation, and themselves be aware of what the limitations are, and not just be simply sit around and sit back and expect to be told what the limitations are. So that I think it might actually affect the quality of what we build, or in fact who is in the industry building for us. And I think that that's a very big thing. But I think it's always very important that we have this communication, and I think it's really important that we develop maybe a different system of communication, so it's not simply this adversarial situation I think that we're in now, particularly with the new form of government contract, where it's impossible almost to have a decent conversation without getting into a row. So I think the point is very interesting, and maybe the future of this relationship will also be very interesting as a result. It could be very productive, in fact.
Okay. Do you want to? Yeah. Do you want to just?
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, again, it's like, I mean, I always see. Let's get rid of this. I see a great amount of sense being taught in this room, and what frustrates me, we all go home, and we all switch on the television, and we all watch a reality show on TV. And it all just, no. The majority, unfortunately, do. And we all, this life goes on the same, similar way. So, I mean, it seems to me that it needs to be, I mean, if it is a revolution, that revolution has to come pretty quickly, in my view, maybe taking on from Jim Roach's point. The other thing for me is actually just asking Martin earlier on to switch off the lights was a means to me of testing this room. This room is a beautiful room. And for me, beauty fundamentally makes me a happy person. And that's what beauty does to people. It puts a smile on your face, it makes you happy. And I would like to see all architecture is beautiful. And that's all I want to see. I don't care what it's called, sustainable, modernist, postmodernist. It's just got to be beautiful. And can we have a straight line in it? Because I believe in the straight line. I believe the straight line is the mark of man. This is a parallel room. This is an orthogonal room. It is a beautiful, classically proportioned room. And nothing, to me, indicates to me that we all have to live in circles, or if this is a fundamental sort of point about what architecture has to become. No, I understand, is about 60% of the area of window, the collective floor area, but I don't need to switch a light on. And I know as the light fades in this room, we're going to have to switch those lights on. And how much do those lights cost to run? As against the embodied energy or all those kind of things. So I don't particularly want to move back to classical architecture that our Vere think is fantastic. I think we need to make technologies that solve the energy problems and crises that we have. I don't know if it's architects that need to do that, but I would like to be part of that, back to Mike's point about sustainable strategies. That's what we're, I want to lead, not follow. And that's what the mothers did. And that's what architects have to do.
I know it's these debates tend to be too short. I mean, we're talking about huge things. I'm very interested in straight lines. I'm not particularly interested in earthships. I'm not particularly interested in anything that actually looks sustainable in capital S with inverted commas around it. I'm very interested in good design. I'm very interested in aesthetic design. But I'm also very interested in us actually doing things that we understand and are real, and sustainability at every scale, whether that be where a building is located, whether that's the village, the community, the food we use, and also a construction detail. And at every scale of that, we can be aesthetic, we can do extraordinary things, but I think we have to acknowledge where we are, use every tool that we can use to do that. And I think it's going to be exciting. And yes, there should be a lot of people uncomfortable because it's going to be hard. But out, like Kieran said earlier on, out of hard things can come really, really good architecture.